The nursing home aide caught my arm in the parking lot. "Your mother isn't safe here. Get her out tonight." Her grip was tight enough to leave marks, her dark eyes darting toward the building's entrance where security cameras tracked the lot. I'd just finished my evening visit with my mother, the same routine I'd followed for 3 months since placing her at Meadowbrook Senior Living after her stroke left her partially paralyzed and struggling to speak. Now this young woman, maybe 30, with a name badge that read Keisha Williams, CNA, was telling me to remove my mother from the most expensive care facility in the county. I pulled my arm back gently, confused and tired from a long day at work. "I'm sorry, what?" She glanced over her shoulder toward the building's glass doors, then back to me. "Your mother, Eleanor Sterling, room 218. She's not safe here. None of them are safe. But your mother, she's getting worse because she can't tell you what's happening to her." My first thought was that this woman was having some kind of mental health crisis, or maybe trying to extort money from families. "Is there a problem with her care? I can speak to the director about reassigning staff or—" "Don't talk to Gerald Thornton about anything," Keisha interrupted, her voice urgent but controlled. "He already knows. They all know. That's the problem. I'd been visiting my mother every other evening for 3 months, watching her slowly recover from the stroke that had stolen her ability to walk unassisted and reduced her speech to fragmented sentences. She'd been a high school English teacher for 30 years, the kind of woman who could recite entire Shakespeare sonnets from memory and corrected everyone's grammar at family dinners. The stroke had hit her hard, not just physically but emotionally, stealing the one thing she'd always had complete mastery over: language. The neurologist, Dr. Amrita Patel, had said recovery would be slow, that speech therapy and physical therapy would help, but she might never return to her baseline. I'd researched facilities obsessively, reading reviews, touring buildings, checking state inspection records. Meadowbrook had seemed perfect. 5-star ratings, gleaming facilities, a staff-to-patient ratio that exceeded industry standards, and pricing that reflected their premium positioning at $8,500 per month. My mother's retirement savings and long-term care insurance covered most of it, and I supplemented the difference because I wanted her to have the best. The intake process had been thorough, with multiple assessments and care plan meetings. Gerald Thornton, the executive director, had personally assured me that my mother would receive excellent care tailored to her specific needs. He was in his late 50s, silver-haired and professional, with framed credentials covering his office walls and a manner that radiated competent authority. I'd trusted him completely. The first month had seemed fine. My mother was adjusting to the facility, participating in therapy sessions, eating regularly according to the meal logs the staff maintained. She couldn't tell me much about her days because forming complete sentences exhausted her, but she'd nod when I asked if she was comfortable, squeeze my hand when I visited, and occasionally manage a smile. I told myself the confused look in her eyes sometimes was just frustration with her limitations, not fear. In the second month, I started noticing small things that didn't quite add up. Bruises on my mother's arms that the staff explained were from blood thinners making her skin fragile. A missing watch that was supposedly lost in the laundry. Medication errors noted in her chart where she'd received doses late or not at all, always with explanations about staffing changes or computer system glitches. Each incident had a reasonable explanation when I asked about it, and the staff was always apologetic and professional in their responses. I'd worked in corporate risk management for 15 years, analyzing patterns and identifying anomalies, but I was so desperate to believe my mother was in good hands that I accepted every excuse without pushing harder. Now, standing in the parking lot with Keisha Williams gripping my arm and telling me to remove my mother immediately, all those small incidents began connecting into something much darker. "I don't understand," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "If there's a problem with her care, there are proper channels. I can file a complaint with the state, request a care plan review." Keisha shook her head, cutting me off. "The state was here last month. Routine inspection. Everything looked perfect because Gerald knows when they're coming weeks in advance. He moves the worst cases to the hospital for evaluations, makes sure staffing levels are maxed out that week, coaches everyone on what to say. The inspectors see exactly what he wants them to see." She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo. It was my mother, asleep in her bed, but her positioning looked wrong. Her left arm was twisted at an unnatural angle, and there were visible red marks on her wrist. This was taken 3 nights ago during the overnight shift. The night aide, Claire, she's been rough with residents who can't communicate well. Your mother tried to get out of bed to use the bathroom, probably because nobody answered her call button for 20 minutes, and Claire grabbed her and shoved her back down. Hard enough to leave those marks. I documented it and reported it to Gerald, and you know what happened? Claire is still working her regular shifts, and I got written up for using my personal phone on the floor and violating resident privacy by taking the photo. My hands started shaking as I looked at the image. Those marks on my mother's wrist were consistent with the bruises I'd been seeing, the ones staff had attributed to blood thinners. Why are you telling me this? Why not go to the police, the media, anyone else? Keisha's expression was bitter. Because I tried. I called Adult Protective Services 6 weeks ago after I saw another resident, Mr. Chen. She stopped herself. Another resident in room 302 was left in soiled bedding for 8 hours on a weekend because the staffing was short and nobody wanted to deal with him. The APS investigator came out, interviewed Gerald, looked at records, and closed the case as unsubstantiated. Gerald is good at covering tracks. Documentation gets altered in the system, staff members who might talk get fired for unrelated reasons, and families who complain too much get told their loved one might be better served at a different facility. The residents who could advocate for themselves already transferred out. The ones who are left, like your mother, they can't speak up because they literally can't speak. That's why I'm telling you directly. Get her out tonight, and then maybe you'll have enough credibility to make someone listen. I wanted to dismiss this as paranoid conspiracy thinking, but the photo was right there on her phone showing my mother in distress, and Keisha's fear seemed genuine. If I remove her tonight, won't that alert them that someone talked? Keisha nodded. Probably, but I'm quitting anyway. I can't watch this anymore. I've worked at 4 different facilities, and I've never seen anything like Meadowbrook. The neglect is systemic, and the abuse is opportunistic. And Gerald created an environment where both thrive because he's more concerned with profit margins than care quality. He cut staffing to the minimum legal requirement, which means on night shifts, there are 2 aides for 40 residents. That's impossible. Things get missed. People get hurt, and the residents who can't advocate for themselves suffer most. She glanced at her phone. I have to get back inside before my break ends. I've already said too much. But please, please get your mother out of here. At least move her somewhere else while you investigate. Because I promise you, if you start asking hard questions while she's still here, they'll find a reason to transfer her to the hospital or another facility before you can document anything. She walked away quickly, disappearing back through the glass doors into the building's bright atrium, where families were probably having pleasant dinners with their loved ones, completely unaware of what might be happening on the floors above. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, my mind racing through options. I could go back inside right now and demand to see my mother's complete medical records. I could call the police and report suspected elder abuse. I could remove my mother immediately, but where would she go? I couldn't bring her to my apartment, which was a 3rd-floor walk-up completely unsuitable for someone in a wheelchair. My brother lived 3 states away and had barely visited since the stroke. I had maybe 12 hours to make a decision if I took Keisha's warning seriously. I drove home and spent the night researching everything I could find about Meadowbrook Senior Living. The public records showed nothing alarming. State inspection reports from the past 3 years were clean with only minor violations for documentation issues, all corrected. Online reviews were overwhelmingly positive, with families praising the facility's cleanliness, staff professionalism, and quality of care. But when I dug deeper into complaint records through the state's database, I found a pattern. 7 families had filed formal complaints in the past 18 months, alleging neglect, rough handling, medication errors, and missing belongings. All 7 complaints had been investigated and closed as unsubstantiated or resolved. I pulled up the facility's financial records through public filings and found something interesting. Meadowbrook had been purchased by a private equity firm called Horizon Healthcare Partners 2 years ago. Since the acquisition, staffing costs had decreased by 32%, while resident capacity had increased by 15%. The math was simple and brutal. More residents, fewer staff, higher profit margins. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to Meadowbrook at 7 a.m., arriving during the shift change when the overnight staff was leaving and day shift arriving. I wanted to catch Gerald Thornton before he'd had his coffee and prepared his usual polished responses. The receptionist, a woman named Dorothy, who'd always been friendly during my visits, looked surprised to see me so early. "Mr. Sterling, is everything all right? Your mother is still sleeping. I need to speak with Gerald immediately. It's urgent." She made a call, and a few minutes later, Gerald appeared in the lobby looking crisp and professional despite the early hour. "David, what brings you in so early? Is everything okay with Eleanor?" I kept my voice steady and professional. "I need to review my mother's complete medical records, all nursing notes, medication administration records, incident reports, everything. I'd like them this morning." Gerald's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Of course, that's your right. Our records department can prepare copies for you, though it typically takes 3 to 5 business days to compile everything and redact protected health information about other residents who might be mentioned in group notes. I'll wait while you compile them. I'm not leaving without them." Now Gerald frowned slightly. "David, is there a specific concern? If there's an issue with Eleanor's care, I'd like to address it directly. There are bruises on my mother's arms and wrists that staff have attributed to blood thinners. I'd like to see documentation of every incident where she's been injured, and I'd like to speak with the staff members who were present when those injuries occurred." Gerald was quiet for a moment, then gestured toward his office. "Let's talk privately." I followed him down a hallway I'd walked dozens of times to his corner office with its view of the facility's gardens. He closed the door and sat behind his desk, his demeanor shifting from warm professionalism to something cooler and more guarded. "David, I understand that having a parent in long-term care is stressful. Families often look for someone to blame when their loved one isn't recovering as quickly as hoped. The bruising you've observed is completely consistent with Eleanor's anticoagulant therapy and her limited mobility. We've documented every instance in her chart with photographs and assessments. I can have our nursing supervisor, Diane, review those with you. I want to see them now, all of them. And I want to know why my mother had marks on her wrists 3 nights ago that looked like restraint injuries." Gerald's expression hardened. "Who told you that? Was it one of our staff members? Does it matter? Either my mother has injuries that weren't properly documented, or she doesn't. Which is it?" He stood up and walked to his computer, pulling up records. 3 nights ago, your mother became agitated during the overnight shift and attempted to get out of bed without assistance. This is documented in the nursing notes at 0200 hours. The night aide, Claire, responded to prevent a fall and helped her back into bed. Your mother has a history of impulsivity due to her stroke affecting her judgment, and our protocol is to redirect her safely. If she sustained any minor skin irritation from that interaction, it would be because her skin is fragile and tears easily, not because of any inappropriate force. I want to speak with Claire. She's not on duty today. Then I want her contact information so I can speak with her directly, or I want you to call her in, and I want to see the incident report from that night." Gerald sat back down, his patience visibly thinning. "David, I'm trying to be accommodating here, but you're making serious implications about our staff. If you're not satisfied with Eleanor's care, we can certainly discuss transitioning her to another facility. But I won't allow you to harass our employees based on secondhand information from someone who may have their own agenda." The threat was subtle but clear. If I pushed too hard, they'd remove my mother and I'd lose access to any evidence of wrongdoing. I needed to change tactics. "I'm not trying to harass anyone. I'm trying to understand what happened to my mother. If the care here is as excellent as you've always told me, then you should have no problem providing complete transparency." Gerald seemed to relax slightly, sensing he'd regained control of the conversation. "Of course. I'll have Diane pull together all the relevant documentation from the past month, and we can review it together this afternoon. Say, 3 p.m.? That will give us time to ensure everything is complete and properly organized." I agreed because I needed to buy time to figure out my next move. I left his office and went directly to my mother's room on the 2nd floor. She was awake, sitting in her wheelchair by the window, her breakfast tray mostly untouched. When she saw me, her face lit up with recognition. But then something else flickered across her expression: fear. She raised her right hand, the one with better motor control, and pointed at the door. Then she made a gesture I didn't understand at first, a pushing motion with her palm. She was trying to tell me something, but her limited speech made it impossible to get the words out. "Mom, are you okay? Are people here hurting you?" She nodded, tears forming in her eyes. Then she pointed at her wrist and made that pushing gesture again. Someone had pushed her, grabbed her. She was confirming what Keisha had told me. I spent 2 hours with my mother, and during that time, I paid attention to things I'd been unconsciously ignoring during previous visits. The call button was clipped to her bed rail, but positioned in a way that required significant reach for her to access it with her limited mobility. Her water pitcher was on the table across the room, completely out of reach. Small things that seemed like oversights but created dependency and frustration. When I asked for her nurse, a young woman named Stacy appeared and seemed genuinely caring, checking my mother's vitals and adjusting her position in the wheelchair. But when I asked about the bruising on her arms, Stacy's response was practiced and smooth. "Oh yes, we've been monitoring that. It's very common with blood thinners. We've documented it in her chart and her doctor is aware." Has her doctor actually seen these bruises, or just read notes about them? Stacy hesitated. Dr. Patel receives weekly updates on all her patients here. If she had concerns, she would order an evaluation. I made a mental note to call Dr. Patel directly and left Meadowbrook around noon with a plan forming. I needed evidence that would be undeniable, documentation that couldn't be explained away or altered. I needed to see what happened when I wasn't there. I spent the afternoon researching surveillance options and found a company that specialized in covert cameras marketed toward families with concerns about care facilities. The devices looked like everyday objects: alarm clocks, phone chargers, picture frames. I ordered 3 different models with overnight shipping and spent $800 on equipment that might give me the evidence I needed. Then I called Dr. Amrita Patel's office and requested an urgent appointment to discuss my mother's care. Her receptionist said the doctor was booked solid for 2 weeks. But when I mentioned suspected elder abuse at the nursing home, I was transferred to a nurse who took detailed notes and promised the doctor would call me back within the hour. Dr. Patel called me at 4:30 p.m. while I was sitting in my car outside Meadowbrook, watching the evening shift change. She'd been my mother's neurologist for 3 months and had always been professional and thorough, a woman in her early 40s with 15 years of experience in stroke rehabilitation. "Mr. Sterling, I received a message about concerns regarding your mother's care at Meadowbrook. Can you tell me specifically what you've observed?" I explained everything: the bruises, the staff excuses, Keisha's warning, the photo, my mother's fearful reaction when I asked if someone was hurting her. Dr. Patel was quiet for a moment after I finished. "I've been reviewing Eleanor's records from the facility, and I have to say, something has bothered me for the past few weeks. Her progress has plateaued in a way that's inconsistent with her initial trajectory. She was responding well to therapy initially, but in the past month, she's actually regressed in some areas. I attributed it to depression, which is common after stroke, but now I'm wondering if there's something else happening." "Could neglect or rough handling cause regression?" I asked. "Absolutely. Stress, fear, inadequate therapy, medication errors, all of those can impact recovery. If a patient isn't receiving proper care or is being traumatized by their caregivers, we'd expect to see exactly what I'm seeing in Eleanor's case. I think we need to order a comprehensive evaluation and potentially remove her from Meadowbrook while we investigate." She paused. "I should tell you, you're not the first family to raise concerns about that facility. I have 3 other patients there, and 2 families have mentioned similar issues in the past 6 months. I can't prove anything without evidence, but my clinical instinct tells me something is wrong." "What did those families do?" "One transferred their father to a different facility, and he improved dramatically within weeks. The other kept their mother there because they couldn't afford anywhere else, and she died 2 months ago from what was officially listed as complications from her existing conditions. But I've wondered since then if neglect contributed to her decline. The confirmation from an independent medical professional made everything more real. I'm installing cameras in my mother's room. Is that legal? Check your state's recording laws, but generally, yes. Many families use monitoring devices in care facilities, though the facilities don't love it. Just be aware that if you do find evidence of abuse, you'll need to follow proper reporting protocols to ensure it's admissible if this becomes a legal matter. I thanked Dr. Patel and hung up, then called the police non-emergency line. The dispatcher connected me to the Elder Abuse Unit, and I spoke with Detective Angela Reeves, a 20-year veteran who specialized in cases involving vulnerable adults. I explained the situation, and she asked me to come to the station to file a formal report. At the police station, Detective Reeves was in her late 40s with short gray hair and a direct manner that inspired confidence. She took my statement for over an hour, asking detailed questions about specific incidents, staff members, and timeline. I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Sterling. These cases are incredibly difficult to prove. Facilities like Meadowbrook have lawyers and know how to protect themselves. Unless we have clear evidence of criminal neglect or assault, it's hard to build a case that prosecutors will take. The fact that you're planning to install cameras is smart, but be aware that what you capture might not be dramatic. It's more likely to show neglect, oversight, and rough handling that falls into a gray area legally. So even if I document abuse, nothing will happen? She shook her head. I didn't say that. What I'm saying is that you need to be strategic. Document everything. Keep copies of all medical records. Get statements from other families if possible, and build a pattern. One incident is an accident. Multiple incidents across multiple residents is institutional failure. That's what we can prosecute. She gave me her direct number and told me to call immediately if I found anything concerning. I returned to Meadowbrook for the 3 p.m. meeting with Gerald Thornton and the nursing supervisor, Diane Russell. They presented me with a folder containing selected notes from my mother's chart, incident reports about the bruising, all attributed to blood thinners and fragile skin, and therapy progress notes that painted a picture of a patient receiving excellent care who was simply experiencing the normal challenges of stroke recovery. Everything was documented, photographed, and explained in clinical language that seemed reasonable on the surface. Gerald walked me through it all with practiced empathy. David, I understand your concerns, and I want you to know that we take any allegation of improper care extremely seriously. As you can see from these records, your mother is receiving attentive care from a dedicated team. The bruising is unfortunate but medically expected given her condition. If you'd like, we can arrange for an independent medical evaluation to confirm our assessment. The offer seemed generous until I realized it was a trap. If I accepted an evaluation arranged by them, they'd control who examined my mother and what questions were asked. I've already arranged for Dr. Patel to conduct an independent evaluation. She'll be here tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. to examine my mother and review her care firsthand. Gerald's expression tightened slightly. Of course, Dr. Patel is always welcome. We'll ensure staff are available to answer any questions she might have. That evening, I received the overnight delivery of surveillance equipment. I went to Meadowbrook during visiting hours and spent time with my mother while discreetly installing a camera disguised as a digital clock on her bedside table, positioned to capture most of the room including her bed and the doorway. I set it to motion-activated recording with cloud backup, so even if someone discovered and destroyed the device, the footage would already be saved remotely. I also installed a second camera disguised as a phone charger in the bathroom, concerned about what might happen during the most vulnerable moments. My mother watched me set everything up with confusion until I explained in simple terms that I was making sure she was safe. She squeezed my hand and nodded, understanding what I couldn't say directly, that I believed someone was hurting her and I was finally doing something about it. Over the next 3 days, the cameras captured footage that made my hands shake with rage every time I reviewed it. The first night, my mother pressed her call button at 11 p.m., presumably needing the bathroom or medication. Nobody responded for 38 minutes. I watched the timestamp tick forward while she pressed the button repeatedly, becoming increasingly agitated. When a staff member finally appeared, it was Claire, the night aide Keisha had mentioned. Claire's response to my mother's distress was to disconnect the call button, tell her to wait until morning, and leave. My mother, unable to wait, attempted to get herself out of bed and fell, landing on the floor between the bed and the wall. She lay there for another 19 minutes before Claire returned, found her on the floor, and called for help. The incident report filed that night said my mother had attempted to ambulate without assistance despite repeated instructions, resulting in a fall with no injuries noted. It made no mention of the ignored call button or the 40-plus minutes she'd spent needing help. The second night captured Claire and another aide, whose name badge read Jennifer, discussing my mother while she was right there in the room, unable to respond, but clearly hearing every word. "This one's a pain in the ass," Claire said while roughly changing my mother's bedding. "Always pushing the button, always needing something. I swear these stroke patients are the worst." Jennifer laughed. "At least she can't complain to anyone. The ones who can talk will get you fired." They weren't whispering. They were talking about my mother like she was an object, not a person, like her inability to speak fluently meant she couldn't understand or feel humiliation. I watched my mother's face on the footage, saw the tears running down her cheeks, saw her try to form words that wouldn't come. The third night was the worst. My mother had an episode of incontinence and pressed her call button. Nobody responded. After 20 minutes, she tried to clean herself up, but couldn't manage it with her limited mobility. When Claire finally appeared an hour later, she responded with visible disgust and anger. "You did this on purpose because you're pissed nobody came fast enough. Well, tough. We're short-staffed and you're just going to have to wait." She cleaned my mother roughly, not bothering to be gentle, leaving her in a soiled gown because the clean ones are all in the laundry and I'm not running down there at 2 a.m. for you. I downloaded all the footage and made 3 separate copies, storing them in different locations, including cloud storage. Then I called Detective Reeves and Dr. Patel. We met at the police station the next morning, and I showed them everything. Dr. Patel's clinical composure cracked when she watched the fall scene. "This is criminal negligence. The failure to respond to call buttons, the rough handling, the verbal abuse, all of it constitutes elder abuse under state law. And the fall, leaving her on the floor for almost 20 minutes, that could have resulted in serious injury or death." Detective Reeves was taking notes, her expression grim. "I'm going to need the original recordings and a sworn statement from you. We'll also need Dr. Patel's medical opinion on whether this care meets acceptable standards. Then I'm opening a criminal investigation into Meadowbrook and specifically into Claire and Jennifer for assault and criminal neglect. I'm also going to contact Adult Protective Services and request an emergency removal order for your mother." "How long will that take?" I asked. "If we move fast, we can have her out of there by tonight, but we need to coordinate with APS and ensure we have a safe placement arranged. Can you secure a bed at another facility quickly?" I spent the next 4 hours calling every nursing home within a 50-mile radius. Most had waiting lists or couldn't accommodate my mother's specific needs. Finally, I found Riverside Manor, a smaller facility with excellent reviews and an unexpected opening due to another family transferring their relative closer to home. The administrator, a woman named Grace Chen, listened to my situation and said she'd hold the bed for 24 hours. By 6 p.m., Adult Protective Services investigator Linda Cho arrived at Meadowbrook with police escort and a court order for emergency removal of Eleanor Sterling due to credible allegations of abuse and neglect. I was there when it happened, watching Gerald Thornton's face turn red as he read the order. "This is outrageous. We've cooperated fully with Mr. Sterling's concerns, provided complete documentation, and now you're removing his mother based on what? Selectively edited videos that don't show context?" Linda Cho, a woman in her 30s with a law degree and 5 years of experience investigating abuse cases, didn't flinch. "The videos show clear violations of care standards, Mr. Thornton. Call button response times that exceed acceptable limits, rough handling, verbal abuse, and inadequate hygiene assistance. Combined with medical evidence of regression and injuries consistent with neglect, we have sufficient cause for emergency removal. You'll receive formal notice of our investigation, and I suggest you retain legal counsel." I helped pack my mother's belongings, while staff members watched with expressions ranging from concern to hostility. Keisha appeared in the doorway, her eyes meeting mine briefly. She mouthed, "Thank you," before disappearing back down the hallway. My mother seemed confused by the sudden activity until I explained we were moving her somewhere safer. The relief on her face was immediate and heartbreaking. Over the next week, the investigation expanded rapidly. Detective Reeves obtained a warrant for Meadowbrook's complete records and interviewed current and former staff members. 3 aides came forward with stories similar to Keisha's, describing systematic understaffing, pressure to cut corners, and a culture where administrators ignored complaints. The cameras I'd installed weren't the only evidence anymore. Other families, hearing about the investigation through news coverage, came forward with their own concerns. One family had installed cameras months earlier and had footage showing similar patterns of neglect with their father. Another had medical records showing unexplained injuries and medication errors. The pattern Detective Reeves had talked about was emerging clearly. This wasn't isolated bad behavior by individual staff members. This was institutional failure driven by profit maximization at the expense of vulnerable residents. The state health department opened its own investigation and suspended Meadowbrook's license pending review. The facility was ordered to stop admitting new residents and to increase staffing immediately to acceptable ratios. Gerald Thornton hired expensive lawyers who issued statements about the facility's commitment to quality care and their intention to fight these baseless allegations. But the evidence kept mounting. Claire and Jennifer were arrested and charged with criminal neglect and elder abuse. Their lawyers tried to argue they were following the facility's protocols and shouldn't be held personally responsible for systemic failures, but the recordings of their verbal abuse and rough handling were too damaging. Both eventually accepted plea deals that included jail time and permanent bans from working in healthcare. Gerald Thornton and Horizon Healthcare Partners faced civil lawsuits from 17 families seeking damages for neglect and emotional distress. I hired an attorney, Frank Delacroix, a specialist in elder law with a reputation for taking on corporate-owned care facilities. He filed a lawsuit on behalf of my mother seeking compensatory and punitive damages, and within weeks, other families joined, creating a class action. The discovery process revealed internal communications between Thornton and Horizon executives discussing staffing cuts and profit margins with no mention of resident care impact. One particularly damning email from a Horizon VP read, "We can operate at minimum regulatory compliance and still maintain our 5-star rating through careful management of family expectations and inspection timing. The math works as long as we don't have any major incidents that draw regulatory attention." They'd built a business model around providing the minimum legally required care while charging premium prices and pocketing the difference. It was healthcare fraud on a massive scale, targeting the most vulnerable population. 6 months after removing my mother from Meadowbrook, I sat in a courtroom watching Gerald Thornton and 3 Horizon executives face criminal charges for healthcare fraud, Medicaid fraud, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. The evidence was overwhelming. Beyond the individual cases of neglect, prosecutors had found systematic billing fraud, where the facility charged for therapy services that were never provided, medical supplies that were never ordered, and staffing levels that were never maintained. The company had stolen millions from Medicare and Medicaid while providing substandard care that harmed residents. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and the verdict was unanimous on all counts. Thornton received 8 years in prison. The Horizon executives received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years. The company itself was forced into bankruptcy, its assets liquidated to pay restitution to victims and their families. Meadowbrook Senior Living closed permanently. The building sold to a nonprofit organization that planned to reopen it under new management with actual commitment to quality care. My mother's settlement was substantial, enough to ensure she'd receive excellent care for the rest of her life. But more importantly, she was recovering at Riverside Manor under Grace Chen's management. The difference was immediate and striking. Within 2 weeks of the transfer, my mother's anxiety decreased noticeably. Within a month, her speech therapy showed measurable progress. By 3 months, she was speaking in fuller sentences and had regained some mobility through proper physical therapy. Dr. Patel said the improvement was remarkable, but not surprising. Eleanor was being traumatized at Meadowbrook, and trauma disrupts recovery. Remove the trauma, provide appropriate care, and the brain can heal. She may never fully recover, but she's already surpassed where she was, and that's because she's finally safe. Keisha Williams, the aide who'd warned me in that parking lot, became a key witness in the criminal trials and civil cases. Her testimony about the culture at Meadowbrook, the pressure to cut corners, and the retaliation against staff who reported concerns was devastating to the defense. After the facility closed, she found work at a different nursing home with better management and helped develop new protocols for mandatory abuse reporting training. She'd risked her job and potentially her safety to warn me, and I made sure the court knew about her courage. Several families approached her after the trial to thank her, saying she'd helped save their loved ones by speaking up when it mattered most. The broader impact of the case extended beyond Meadowbrook. The state legislature passed new laws requiring stricter staffing ratios, mandatory surveillance in common areas of care facilities, and harsher criminal penalties for corporate executives who knowingly allowed abuse. The law was informally named Eleanor's Law after my mother, who'd become the public face of the case. Advocacy groups used our story to push for similar reforms in other states, arguing that private equity ownership of healthcare facilities created inherent conflicts between profit and care that required stronger regulation. I became an accidental activist, speaking at conferences about elder care, consulting with families who had concerns about their loved ones, and working with legislators on policy improvements. It wasn't a role I'd ever imagined for myself, but standing in that parking lot listening to Keisha's warning had changed my entire life trajectory. I couldn't unknow what I'd learned about how vulnerable our elderly population was and how easily institutional systems could fail them. 3 years after that night in the parking lot, I visited my mother at Riverside Manor on a Sunday afternoon. She was in the garden, participating in a group activity with other residents, laughing at something one of the activity's staff had said. When she saw me, she smiled and waved, calling out, "David," in a clear voice that still sometimes surprised me with its strength. We sat together in the sunshine, and she told me about her week, the new resident who'd moved in, the concert they'd attended, the book club she'd joined where they were reading, ironically, a novel about family and memory. "I'm proud of you," she said clearly, the words coming easier now after 3 years of proper therapy. "You saved my life. You saved a lot of lives." I shook my head. "Keisha saved your life. I just listened." "You did more than listen. You believed her. You believed me when I couldn't speak." "That's everything." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, and I thought about all the things that had to align for this outcome. Keisha's courage, my willingness to question authority, Dr. Patel's clinical instincts, Detective Reeves's thoroughness, the technology that let me document what happened when I wasn't there. Any one of those elements missing and my mother might still be at Meadowbrook, suffering in silence, declining from neglect disguised as appropriate care. Or worse, she might have died there, another elderly victim of a system that valued profit over people. The lawsuit settlements were finalized, the criminal sentences handed down, the facility closed and sold. But the work continued because Meadowbrook wasn't unique. Across the country, there were hundreds of similar facilities with similar problems, operated by corporations that prioritized shareholder returns over resident well-being. Every week I got emails from families with concerns, people who'd found my contact information through news articles or advocacy websites, asking for advice on how to protect their loved ones. I tried to help everyone, sharing what I'd learned about warning signs, documentation strategies, and legal resources. Some cases resulted in transfers to better facilities. Others led to investigations and reforms. A few ended in tragedy because families didn't recognize the danger until it was too late. Those were the hardest, the ones where I wondered if I could have done more, or spoken louder, or pushed harder to reach people before abuse became fatal. My mother finished her story about book club and asked about my work. I told her about a new case I was consulting on, another family with concerns about rough handling and medication errors. She listened thoughtfully, then said, "Make sure they document everything, and tell them to trust their instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is." It was exactly what Keisha had done that night in the parking lot, trusting her instincts enough to risk her job and warn a stranger. That moment of courage in the face of institutional power had created ripples that spread far beyond one family and one facility. It had exposed a systemic problem and created accountability where none had existed before. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the question I'd asked Keisha that night. Why tell me instead of going to authorities? She'd tried the official channels and been dismissed, ignored, or actively retaliated against. The system that was supposed to protect vulnerable adults had failed repeatedly because it was designed to trust institutions over individuals, to accept professional documentation over personal testimony, to prioritize smooth operations over messy truth. Changing that system required evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away, and it required families willing to fight, even when fighting was expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally devastating. I'd been lucky because I had resources, education, and support. But what about families who didn't? What about residents whose families rarely visited, who had no one to notice the bruises or ask hard questions? Those were the people who remained most vulnerable, the ones for whom the system still failed regularly. The work of protecting them would never be finished, but at least now there was legal precedent, public awareness, and a growing movement of advocates who refused to accept neglect as the cost of aging. My mother was safe, recovering, engaging with life in ways that had seemed impossible 3 years ago. That was everything. But it was also a starting point, not an ending, because her safety came at a cost that revealed how many others remained unsafe. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.